Hi everyone. In today's video, I'm going to be covering how I managed to have zombies spawning in my mobile game called Remain Alive. It's available on the iOS and the Android store. Definitely recommend you check it out. The zombie spawning mechanic in my game needed to feel that as the player moved around their environment, the zombies were spawning in, finding the player, and chasing the player. The real challenge here was to not pre-place spawn points every place a zombie could spawn. I wanted the player at all times to feel like they were just being chased by the zombies. Now the key here is that I don't want to pre-place my spawn points, but I want to mark the level as being capable of spawning a zombie, and then create a system on top of it that manages how many zombies can be present at one time and how to manage the maximum amount of zombies as those zombies are either killed by the player or they're respawning, or maybe increasing the difficulty as time goes on. You'll have more zombies spawn in. So a lot of different requirements. Let's kind of dive in here to a quick example. So on my screen here, I have the game inside of Unity. I'll launch the game real quick. It'll just take a second to load. And then down here on the bottom of the screen, you'll see the game playing. So basically, you can see as the zombies spawn in, they'll chase my player. I can run away from the zombies, and then I can also turn around. I can fight the zombies. And you'll see that as I keep moving around, more and more will spawn in. So these zombies are spawning based on proximity to the player. So again, on the bottom of the screen here, you'll see that they'll basically come from off screen, and with the camera facing down, that's just a little easier to hide. But I'll go over the systems that I use to kind of create this effect. So number one, the big system that I'm using here is Unity's Culling Group. So the Culling Group in Unity is fantastic from a performance perspective. And its main goal here is to basically create these individual, what they refer to as bounding spears that you can place, either by attaching a script that creates them or programmatically creating them in the level. They are calculated, within the engine when the camera calculations are happening, so they're very high performing. You can give them some different properties. The main property is you're going to give them a radius, so it needs to kind of know how big that spear is. And generally, you can give that bounding spear position as well. So the position here and the radius it's two inputs, and then you basically give these bounding spears to the culling group, and you give the culling group a reference to your camera, right? It's really straightforward. When bounding groups have a change, so this is as the camera's moving around the environment, you can tap into a number of different properties on the event, so you can see if one of these spears have become visible, have they become invisible, the distance they are away from the players. This is great for like distance-based calculations. This is mainly how I'm using it actually. So with the Culling Group API, if you're not familiar with it, definitely go check it out. It's a huge, huge help here in developing this feature. So in my code here, I basically have this thing called a zombie spawner. And the zombie spawner, its goal is to manage spawning zombies in the game as a whole, right? So it's a system or a manager within the game. You can see I'm creating the culling group here, and I'm just giving it a reference to my camera. I'm tapping into that state changed event that is mentioned in the documentation. One thing that I do here to try to make this to where I'm not actually placing each spawn point by itself is inside of Unity. The one common thing in my scene is the road and the sidewalks. So what I did is I took all the roads and I attached a script called Zombie Spawn Area. And the one thing that it relies on is a box collider. All of the roads and sidewalks here have box colliders. There's a lot in the scene, but they're fairly performant. They're static. Now, the idea here with the zombie spawn point is it can pick up on the box collider. And when it actually picks up on the box collider, let me go to the code real quick. You'll see just to show you here that the requirements for the zombie spawn area are nothing, right? It just holds a reference to the box collider. So on startup, I'll go through, I'll grab my zombie spawn areas, I'll create my bounding spear array, and then I'll go through and create these zombie spawn areas by taking the box collider and grabbing the magnitude and the position of that transform, that zombie spawn area, and then creating a bounding spear, right? So again, the position and the radius of the spear, right? So that's what this is here. So when I go through here, I'll create these, I'll put them into the array, and then basically I have all my bounding spears, right? So each road tile, each sidewalk tile is a bounding spear. There's many of them, hundreds within the scene. Now, being that there are hundreds within the scene, they're still very performant because of the Culling Group API. Now that I have these bounding spears set up, as I mentioned, you can tap into this onStateChanged method. So for me, onStateChanged, this is basically my code behind it. I'm looking at the distance property of this Culling Group event. The distance property here allows you to set different distance bands. And this is like, level of detail. There's a lot of use cases for this, but you could set saying, maybe at, 5 units or 10 units, 20 units, I want to have different functionality of what happens, right? For whatever system it is. In my case, I'm only interested in spawning the zombies. So I just look at the current distance 1 index. So when I go and I set up this Culling Group, one of the other properties that you can pass in here, and I have this, you'll see this method here called set bounding distances, and it takes in this spawn bands object. So in my editor, if I go and let me just pull up my zombie spawner here. I have these things called spawn bands, and in the spawn bands here, you can see 5, 20, and 25. So these are the 3 different bands. Right now, if my distance is at index 1, which is 20, so like 20 units within the game, I'm basically flagging this event saying like, okay, this is the event I want to handle. So in this particular case, it's 1. You'll see I checked this recent areas here. So the thought behind recent areas, so basically recent areas is a stack with a type of int. So I take the index of that Culling Group, right? So again, you have these bounding spears are in an array. You can access them by using the index. And then if you go to the StateChanged method, one of the properties here is index, right? So you have access to the index of the event. So you can go and reference your bounding spear or create some other lookup, based on any other object that's not a bounding spear, right? So if you have a custom script, right, you could create a hash set and basically use the index as the key and then the reference to whatever object is as the value. So recent areas here, basically this is a way for me to not have them spawn in the same areas all the time. So if the player is just kind of running in a circle or running back and forth, it'll try to remember areas that it's seen recently and it'll push them onto the stack. Now the idea is, after a certain cooldown, they'll pop off of the stack. So meaning that if I visit an area and an area doesn't spawn zombies because I've cleared it out kind of from the player's perspective, after a certain amount of time, it'll become eligible again to spawn zombies, right? And that's how I handle it here, right? Is I just use a simple stack, I push, and then I have a delayed timer. Basically, it's a coroutine that comes in and pops off the stack. Now, when the logic triggers here, I call this spawn method. And basically the idea here is I sample my nav mesh, right? So I have the nav mesh in Unity. I'm using the normal Unity AI. I go and I get a random position. So this generate random position here is, let me just go to here it is. So the idea here is that I'm basically going in and I'm taking my vector 3, I'm giving it a range of how much randomness in the different directions it can go, right? Basically saying X and Y, I offset, or X and Z, I offset the Y a little bit just to make sure that I'm right above the ground. Once I get that random position, I go ahead and I sample the nav mesh. And if I get a hit from the nav mesh, I return and then I spawn my zombie. So within my spawn zombie method, I can actually check to see how many zombies have spawned, if I'm at the max or not. This could probably happen a little sooner in the process just to bail out before I do any expensive nav mesh calculations. I instantiate my zombie, and I keep a list of them. In this case, I'm keeping a dictionary of zombie ID to zombie reference. Main reason why I do this is because I manage the amount of zombies in the spawner. And when a zombie dies, for instance, I want to go in and I want to remove the zombie out of my list, right? So if I can say, hey, there's 64 allowed on the screen at one time, I know how many there are because I'm controlling them. I'm adding them to my collection here. And then when those zombies die, I remove them out of my collection. So in this particular case, I'm able to get the ID of the zombie by basically grabbing its instance ID. The zombie has a event that it raises when it dies, and this subscribes to it, right? So it's a really kind of simple way of saying like, hey, when the zombie dies, go ahead and call this method. It's going to give you its instance ID. You're going to grab it, remove it from the list, destroy the zombie. So the spawner is in fact in charge of what happens to that zombie when the zombie issues its death event. So from a implementation perspective, it's really straightforward. There's actually not that much code in here. It's really just leveraging the culling group system, again, from Unity. Unity's calculating this for you. Definitely read the documentation. There are tons of use cases for this. Again, I mentioned things like level of detail, crowd-like simulations, lots of different things, right? You could create a very robust kind of event system within the game using the culling groups and the bounding spears. Anyways, I hope this was helpful. See you in the next video.